wealthy entrepreneur left his wife for a younger woman, but her next move shocked him. The soft clink of crystal glasses filled the air in Ethan Carter's penthouse, a sleek, sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering city skyline. The night sparkled not just from the champagne in his hand, but from the intoxicating taste of victory. He leaned back into the plush leather couch, savoring the golden liquid as it slid smoothly down his throat. He wasn't just celebrating the massive tech acquisition that dominated the headlines that morning. No, this was far more personal. The divorce papers were signed. His marriage to Grace Carter was officially over. He was free. Freedom had a flavor, he thought, swirling the last sip in his glass. It tasted like control, like power, like Lila's cherry red lipstick smeared across his collar. Grace had been a good wife, he admitted to himself. Loyal, dependable, always there. But good had never been enough for a man like him. Over time, she'd faded into the background of his ever-shifting ambitions, becoming a dull echo of the life he wanted. He let out a low, satisfied laugh, relishing how easily he had rewritten the script of his life. The city below pulsed with possibilities, deals to close, parties to crash, people to impress. And none of it would be slowed down by Grace's quiet eyes watching him come home late, or her soft voice asking if he'd eaten. Lila, however, was everything Grace wasn't. Impulsive, young, effortlessly magnetic. She had breathed fire back into his ego, made him feel like the man he used to be. Ethan smirked at the memory of Grace sitting stone-faced across from him at the lawyer's table. She hadn't cried, hadn't begged. Even as her hand trembled while signing away their life together, her chin stayed high. He'd almost respected her pride, but he'd dismissed it just as quickly. When she set down the pen, she'd met his eyes, her voice calm but carrying an edge he hadn't understood back then. "I hope you know what you're doing, Ethan." He had laughed at the time. But now, as he poured himself another drink, her words echoed louder than the clink of the ice in his glass. What could she possibly have meant? He had it all. Money, youth at his side, the kind of lavish freedom most men only dreamed of. Grace was the one left behind, scraping by on the remnants of the life they'd built. Alone. He pictured her now, cramped in some dingy apartment, sitting in the dark, surrounded by dusty memories and quiet regrets. The thought made him smile. Maybe this was exactly what she needed, a chance to pick up her broken pieces and figure herself out. Or whatever people said when their neat little world collapsed. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit apartment across town, Grace Carter sat curled up on a threadbare couch, surrounded by half-unpacked moving boxes. The stale air smelled faintly of cardboard and the lingering dampness from the evening's rain. Earlier that night, Sophie, her 12-year-old daughter, had already drifted off to sleep, her soft breathing barely audible from the small bedroom down the hallway. This tiny apartment was a world away from the grand house they had left behind. The house where Grace once hosted elegant dinners, raised her child, and built the life she foolishly believed would last forever. Now, even the hum of the refrigerator felt louder than her own heartbeat. The walls seemed to lean in at night, reminding her how small she had become in the aftermath of a love story turned bitter. She tugged a thick blanket over her legs and stared at the flickering TV screen, though she wasn't really watching anything. A bowl of untouched soup sat cold on the coffee table, the spoon abandoned hours ago when her appetite vanished. The divorce settlement had been merciless. She had walked away with just enough to scrape by for a while, but Ethan had battled her for every last piece of what they once owned. The house, the investments, even the beach cottage she had lovingly decorated for family holidays. He had shown no mercy. The same man who used to whisper promises in her ear had stripped her down to nearly nothing. Yet it wasn't the loss of marble countertops and designer closets that cut the deepest. It was the humiliation, the sharp ache of knowing she'd been tossed aside like an old coat no longer in season. She could still hear Ethan's final words echoing through her head. "You'll see how much you needed me." They weren't just parting words, they were a cruel dare. A wager that she would crumble without him. The thought made her stomach twist with equal parts shame and defiance. Tears pressed hot behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had already shed enough in the weeks leading up to this night. Now there was no room for tears, only resolve. The soft creak of Sophie's bedroom door broke the heavy silence. Small footsteps padded across the worn hardwood until Grace felt the gentle weight of her daughter settling against her side on the couch. "Mom?" Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper, filled with the kind of innocent worry that could splinter Grace's heart in an instant. "Are you okay?" Grace forced a fragile smile and stroked her daughter's soft hair. "Of course, honey. Just thinking, that's all." Sophie rested her head on her mother's shoulder, her presence a warm, steady reminder of why Grace couldn't afford to collapse. Sophie needed a mother who could stand up, not one lost in a fog of heartbreak. "Are we going to be okay here?" Sophie murmured, her small fingers tracing the frayed edge of the blanket. Grace inhaled deeply, letting her daughter's question anchor her to the moment. "Yes, sweetheart. It's going to be different. But we're going to be just fine. I promise." She brushed her lips against Sophie's forehead, closing her eyes as if that touch could seal the promise to herself, too. The words felt paper-thin as they left her lips, but she clung to them like a lifeline. She had to make them true, for Sophie's sake, even if she didn't quite believe them herself yet. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn, the weight of the day pressing down on her as soon as she opened her eyes. Bills were piling up, and the job hunt had turned into a trail of polite rejections and closed doors. She had applied for over a dozen positions, but her years away from the workforce as a stay-at-home mom seemed to brand her resume as a risk instead of a sacrifice. They saw her as a liability. She brewed a pot of coffee, the rich smell briefly lifting her spirits as she sat down at the tiny kitchen table with her laptop. Sophie's neatly pressed school uniform hung over the back of a chair, and the faint sounds of the neighborhood waking up drifted through the thin apartment walls. Grace scrolled through job listings, her fingers tapping anxiously across the keyboard. An hour later, the rejection emails began pouring in, each one hitting like a gut punch. She closed the laptop and stared at the empty mug in front of her, fighting the rising tide of helplessness. She couldn't let Sophie see her like this. Not beaten down, not doubting her own worth. Her mind drifted back to a lifetime ago, long before Ethan. Back when she'd been a promising business grad with a head full of ideas and the fierce belief she'd build something big one day. She could almost hear that younger version of herself whispering now, "You had dreams once." Where did they go? A sharp knock at the door yanked her back to the present. She opened it to find a delivery driver holding out a large envelope. She signed for it, hands trembling, and tore it open the moment the door clicked shut. Inside was the final confirmation of her divorce settlement. The cold, impersonal language stung almost as much as the split itself. Tucked inside was a neatly typed note from Ethan's lawyer. Polite, clinical, as if her entire life had been boiled down to a few lines of legal jargon. Grace clutched the papers in her hands, eyes squeezed shut. She refused to give Ethan the satisfaction of being right. He thought she'd fail without him. He thought she'd crawl back or fall apart. He'd underestimated her before, and he was about to regret it. She didn't know exactly how, but she knew this wasn't where her story ended. It was where it started over. With her pulse pounding in her ears, she grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Peter?" she said when the familiar voice answered on the second ring. "It's been forever, I know, but I need your help." Her tone was steady, and with that, the gears of her new life slowly began to turn. "Before we go on, if you were in Grace's shoes, rebuilding from scratch with barely anything, what would be your first move? Tell us in the comments, and if this story hits close to home, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the dusty blinds of Grace's cramped kitchen, painting stripes of gold across the scuffed linoleum floor. It wasn't the soft, filtered light she'd grown used to, the sun spilling over granite counters and top-of-the-line appliances back at the old house. Here, it was raw and honest, just like her new reality. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee filled the room, but did nothing to ease the tight knot in her chest. She stared down at the blinking cursor on her laptop, scrolling past job after job. Administrative assistant, receptionist, part-time cashier, too qualified for some, completely unqualified for others. Nothing felt right. Nothing matched the life she'd once had. With a weary sigh, She closed the job board and opened the growing pile of unpaid bills waiting on the corner of the table. The electric bill was due in 2 days. Rent wasn't far behind. Her savings were bleeding out faster than she could patch the holes. But she wouldn't give up. Now. Not with Sophie counting on her to find a way. What little money she had left after the divorce was draining away. Fast. Grace rubbed her temples, feeling the pressure pounding at her skull, and closed her eyes for a moment, wishing she could shut out the harsh truth waiting on her kitchen table. The sound of soft footsteps snapped her back. Sophie shuffled into the kitchen, her hair a sleepy mess, pajama sleeves slipping down over her hands. "Morning, Mom," she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. Grace forced a smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart. You hungry?" Sophie shrugged and slumped into a chair, resting her chin on her hands. "I guess. Can I have cereal?" "Of course." Grace opened the cupboard, grabbed the half-empty box of cereal, and poured it into a chipped bowl, adding a splash of milk before setting it in front of her daughter. She couldn't help noticing the small crease of worry on Sophie's forehead, so much older than a 12-year-old should be. Sophie had always been sharp, far too observant for her age. Some days it felt like both a gift and a cruel twist of fate. Grace's chest tightened as she watched Sophie's tiny hands steady the bowl. How many times had she wished her daughter could just wake up carefree, thinking only about pop quizzes and playground games, not if the lights would stay on another month? "Are you okay, Mom?" Sophie asked between slow bites. Grace hesitated, then nodded, trying to keep her tone breezy. "I'm fine, honey. Just a lot on my mind, that's all." "Is it about money?" Sophie's voice was quiet, but cut right through Grace's chest like a knife. Swallowing her pride, Grace sat down across from her. "A little bit, maybe, but that's not something you need to worry about. I'm working on it." Sophie chewed her cereal thoughtfully, eyes searching her mother's face for cracks in the lie. "I can help, you know. I could get a job after school, or—" "Absolutely not." Grace's voice was firm as she reached across the table, wrapping her hand around Sophie's small fingers. "You're 12. Your only job is to do well in school and just be a kid, okay? Let me handle the rest." She squeezed Sophie's hand tighter, as if trying to press all her unspoken promises into her daughter's skin. "I will not fail you. Not again." Sophie nodded slowly, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. It never did, and Grace hated that, hated how her daughter carried pieces of this burden on her tiny shoulders. It was her job to carry it for both of them. After Sophie left for school, Grace couldn't stand the stifling air of the apartment any longer. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, walking to the neighborhood park just a few blocks away. The crisp autumn air stung her cheeks, and the crunch of fallen leaves under her boots brought a bittersweet calm. From a lonely bench, she could see the city skyline peeking through the trees. The same city where her old life hummed along just fine without her. Somewhere up there, Ethan was probably in a corner office, charming a boardroom full of executives, relishing his next big win. The thought made her stomach twist, but she forced herself to breathe it away. He was the past. Right now, she needed to focus on what came next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Peter. "Hey, Grace," his warm, familiar voice crackled through. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. I might have something for you." Grace's grip tightened around her phone. "Really?" "My cousin owns a cafe downtown. She's looking for someone to help with catering events. It's not exactly corporate work, but it's a start." "I'll take it," Grace said immediately, not giving Peter even a second to finish. Peter laughed softly on the other end. "I thought you'd say that. I'll set up a meeting for tomorrow." When she hung up, Grace allowed herself a small, tired smile. It wasn't the dream job she'd once pictured herself having, but it was something. And right now, something was enough. The next morning, Grace arrived at the cafe, a cozy corner spot with big windows and the comforting smell of fresh bread drifting out from the kitchen. She was greeted by a woman with short, curly hair and a warm, no-nonsense smile. "You must be Grace," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Maria, the owner." Grace shook her hand firmly. "Thank you so much for meeting with me." They sat at a small table by the window, where golden sunlight made the place feel like a safe little pocket of hope. Maria glanced down at Grace's thin resume. Not much on paper, but the parts about managing charity fundraisers and running a tight household budget caught her eye. "I like what I see," Maria said at last, looking up. "You're organized, and I need someone who can keep calm when things get hectic. We get a lot of last-minute orders, and I need reliability. I won't lie, the pay's not great. But if you show up and work hard, there's room to grow." Relief flooded through Grace's chest. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "Perfect," Maria said, smiling. "You can start tomorrow." That night over dinner, Grace shared the news with Sophie, who nearly bounced out of her chair with excitement. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't failing. "That's amazing, Mom," Sophie squealed, her fork clinking against her plate. "Do you think you'll get to make your own recipes?" Grace paused, turning the idea over in her mind. Baking had always been more than just a hobby. It was her therapy, her small act of creation in a world that sometimes felt beyond her control. She had given it up during her marriage, buried it under Ethan's ambitions. But maybe this was her chance to find that joy again. "Maybe," she said softly, smiling. "We'll see." The days that followed tested her resolve quickly. The job was harder than she'd expected. Long hours on her feet, juggling orders, organizing events, running back and forth between the cafe and delivery vans. She came home sore and bone-tired, sometimes dropping onto the couch still wearing her flour-dusted apron. But she never once complained. This was the path she'd chosen, and she'd see it through. One night, as she was washing up after dinner, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was from Ethan. "Heard you found a job. Hope it's enough to get by." The message was short, condescending, typical. Grace stared at the screen, her fingers trembling but her resolve hardening all over again. It was just another reminder of how badly Ethan underestimated her. Instead of replying, Grace simply deleted the message and powered off her phone. She didn't need his approval or his pity. The following week, Maria pulled her aside at the cafe. "Hey Grace, I could use your help creating a menu for an upcoming event. Feel free to pitch in some of your own recipes." Grace's heart fluttered. She stayed up late every night that week, testing batches, tweaking ingredients, scribbling notes on flour-dusted scraps of paper. When the event went off without a hitch and the food was a hit, Maria clapped her on the shoulder and said, "Ever think about starting your own business someday?" Grace laughed it off then, but the seed had been planted. The idea of building something of her own, something no one, not even Ethan, could strip away, made her chest burn with a new kind of hunger. As she walked home that crisp autumn night, the air cold and clean in her lungs, she knew this wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about rebuilding, reclaiming her identity, her dreams, her future. This was only the beginning. Inside Grace's tiny apartment, the air buzzed with the sweet scent of flour and sugar. The quiet tick of the oven timer broke the evening's hush. On the cluttered counter, neat rows of muffins cooled beside bowls of half-mixed batter and a stack of greasy pans waiting for her attention. The kitchen was barely big enough to turn around in, a far cry from the marble countertops she used to wipe spotless every morning. But none of that mattered. This felt bigger than the cramped space. The day had been long. After her shift at the cafe, Grace had come straight home to cook dinner for Sophie, help her with algebra, and then roll up her sleeves for this, her side hustle, her spark of hope. Exhaustion tugged at her, but determination kept her moving. Sophie padded into the kitchen, socked feet making soft whispers on the old linoleum. She wore an oversized hoodie and hugged her math textbook to her chest, but it was the sleepy curiosity in her eyes that made Grace's heart soften. "Mom, it smells so good in here," Sophie said, leaning in to sniff a muffin. "Are these for us?" Grace let out a quiet laugh and shook her head. "Not this time, sweetheart. I've got an order to fill." Sophie's shoulders sagged for a second, but curiosity quickly replaced her disappointment. "An order? For who?" Grace wiped her hands on her faded apron and leaned back against the counter. "Remember Maria's cousin? She runs that little catering business downtown. She needed pastries for a corporate breakfast, and I offered to help out." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Wait, so this is your first real order?" "Yep." Grace smiled, though she could feel the weight of responsibility pressing deep in her chest. "If it goes well, maybe there'll be more." Sophie squealed and clapped her hands together. "That's amazing, Mom. You're basically starting your own business." Grace laughed, warmth flooding her tired bones. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet, okay? Kiddo, right now, it's just a little side gig," Grace said, brushing a stray crumb off Sophie's cheek. Sophie tilted her head, her eyes bright with quiet determination. "But it could be more, right?" Grace hesitated, the thought swirling in the back of her mind like sugar dissolving in tea. Before marriage, she'd always loved baking. Back then, she used to dream about owning her own bakery. A warm little shop that smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon. A place where people felt at home. But those dreams had been boxed up and tucked away, first by the endless demands of family life, then by Ethan's dismissive reminders that her little hobby would never amount to anything real. Now, in the soft glow of the kitchen and Sophie's eager eyes watching her, that old dream didn't feel so foolish anymore. It felt like maybe, just maybe, it still had a heartbeat. "I guess it could," Grace admitted softly. Then she added quickly, "But let's take it one step at a time." Sophie grinned and snatched a muffin off the counter, ignoring her mother's half-hearted protest. She took a big bite, cheeks puffed out like a chipmunk, then beamed. "You're gonna be famous, Mom. I know it." The next morning, Grace carefully loaded the boxes of muffins and scones into the back seat of her old sedan, stacking them so nothing would tip over during the short drive. Still, every bump in the road made her stomach flip. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles ached as she mentally rehearsed what she'd say to Maria's cousin. "Thank you for the opportunity. I hope everything meets your standards. Please let me know if there's anything I can improve." She repeated the words in her head over and over, fighting to calm the nervous fluttering in her chest. When she arrived, the small catering kitchen was already buzzing, servers weaving through narrow aisles, balancing trays of juice and coffee, chefs barking out last-minute instructions. Grace stepped carefully through the organized chaos, clutching her boxes like they were the most fragile things in the world. A woman with salt and pepper hair and a kind, no-nonsense energy spotted her immediately and stepped forward, hand extended. "You must be Grace. I'm Carla, Maria's cousin. She told me good things about your baking." Grace set the boxes down on a corner table and returned Carla's handshake, her smile shy but genuine. "Thank you so much for giving me this chance. I really hope everything's up to your standards." Carla lifted the lid of one box, plucked a muffin out, and turned it slowly in her hand before taking a bite. She chewed, face unreadable, and Grace could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. For a split second, she saw her whole fragile hope teetering on this one bite. Every early morning, every whispered prayer over flour and eggs and rent due dates, all of it balanced on Carla's nod or frown. Finally, Carla nodded, her lips curling into a grin. "These are good, really good. Moist, not too sweet. Exactly what I was hoping for. I think the clients are going to love them." Relief crashed through Grace's chest, and she let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I'm so glad you like them." Carla closed the box and gave her an approving look. "We'll definitely be in touch for more events. If you can handle the orders, there's room for this to really grow, you know." Grace walked back to her car with her head high and her heartbeat light. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't just scraping by. She was building something, and that feeling, small and fragile as it was everything. She was moving forward. Later that evening, Grace sat at the kitchen table, a cheap spiral notebook open in front of her and an old calculator clicking quietly under her fingers. The profit she'd made from the catering order wasn't huge, but it was enough to cover groceries for the week and still leave a little cushion. As she scribbled numbers, her mind buzzed with possibilities. The idea of turning her baking into a real business didn't feel so impossible anymore. If she could pick up a few more catering gigs, maybe sell pastries at the local farmers market on weekends, she might actually build something sustainable. Something that would let her take care of Sophie without lying awake at night worrying about overdue bills or another polite rejection from yet another job application. But the doubt still crept in, whispering at the edges of her thoughts. What if this is just beginner's luck? What if you fail? And just like a ghost, Ethan's cold voice slithered back into her memory. "You're not cut out for this, Grace. Just stick to what you know." She forced the memory away. She'd made it through today. That was enough. Sophie plopped down across from her at the table, a plate of homemade cookies in hand. They were lopsided and drowning in sprinkles, but Grace felt her heart squeeze at the sight. "Can we try selling these too?" Sophie asked hopefully, pushing a cookie toward her mom. Grace took a big bite, making a show of chewing thoughtfully. You know, with a little practice, you might just become my business partner one day." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Really? Really?" Grace laughed, ruffling Sophie's hair until sprinkles scattered everywhere. "Really, but first we might need to work on your decorating skills." The following weekend, Grace loaded her car with trays of muffins, scones, and cookies, her heart fluttering as she headed to the local farmer's market. The early morning air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of fresh produce and the comforting aroma of coffee drifting from nearby stalls. She carefully laid out her pastries, arranging them in neat rows on the fold-out table she'd borrowed from Peter. Her fingers fumbled nervously, but she forced herself to stand tall and greet each passerby with a genuine smile. The morning started slow, a few curious glances, a handful of polite tastes, but as the sun rose higher and the market grew busier, word started to spread. By noon, her table was nearly empty, and the stack of cash in her tin box felt heavier than she'd dared to dream. Peter appeared out of nowhere, hands in his pockets and a grin splitting his face. "Looks like business is booming," he teased, nodding at the crumb-dusted trays. Grace laughed, cheeks pink from the chilly breeze and the thrill of watching her pastries disappear one by one. "It's a good start." Peter handed her a paper cup of steaming coffee and leaned against her table like he'd been there all along. "I always knew you had this in you. So, what's next?" Grace gazed out over the bustling market. Families weaving through stalls, kids tugging at parents' sleeves, the hum of possibility in the air. She didn't know exactly what the future held. But for once, the uncertainty felt more like freedom than fear. "I don't know exactly," she admitted, smiling into her coffee, "but I think I'm ready to find out." And for the first time since her life had fallen apart, Grace felt hope blooming inside her chest, like warm sunlight after a long, bitter storm. She wasn't just building a business, she was rebuilding herself. One step at a time. The brisk morning air nipped at Grace's cheeks as she unloaded trays of muffins and pastries from the back seat of her car, parked just outside a cozy cafe on the edge of the city's lively downtown. The steady hum of early traffic filled the background as she carefully balanced the boxes in her arms and pushed through the glass door, the little bell overhead chiming her arrival. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the rush of nerves and quiet excitement. This delivery meant something bigger than breakfast pastries. It meant progress. Business was picking up faster than she dared to hope. What had started as a desperate side hustle was fast becoming her lifeline. Orders from local cafes, catering gigs, even a few custom requests were trickling in steadily. The money wasn't life-changing yet, but it was enough to cover bills on time and, more importantly, fuel her dream of something more stable and lasting. She set the boxes gently on the counter. The cafe owner, a warm, quick-witted woman named Lila, peeked inside one of the boxes and let out a delighted laugh. "You've outdone yourself again, Grace. Our regulars keep begging for your lemon muffins. I can't keep them on the shelves." Grace felt her shoulders relax, pride and relief bubbling up in her chest. "I'm so glad they're loving them. Let me know any time you want to try something new on the menu." Lila handed over an envelope, payment for the week, then leaned in conspiratorially. "Actually, I've got something to ask you. We're hosting a big weekend brunch event next month. I'd love for you to be our main supplier. Think you can handle it?" The words hit Grace like an electric jolt, the good kind. She had dreamed of an opportunity like this during those long nights of baking alone, whispering quiet promises to herself over mixing bowls and parchment paper. "Absolutely," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Just send me the details, and I'll make sure it's perfect." As she stepped back into the wintry morning, the cold stung her cheeks, but she hardly felt it. Her mind was already spinning. New recipes, bigger orders, maybe even a standing spot on Lila's menu if things went well. It would be more work, more late nights, but maybe, just maybe, it would be worth it. That evening, Grace sat hunched over the small kitchen table, notebooks spread out in front of her, pages scribbled with rough budgets, recipe tweaks, and ingredient lists. The overhead light flickered occasionally, casting a tired glow over the cluttered scene. Across from her, Sophie sat with her own notebook, pretending to focus on homework, but peeking up every few minutes to watch her mom scribble and recalculate. "Mom, you've been writing forever," Sophie said, chewing on the end of her pencil. "What are you doing?" Grace sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose before leaning back in her chair. "Just planning for a big order. It's important. I want everything to be exactly right." Sophie tilted her head thoughtfully. "You always worry about making things perfect, but you haven't messed up yet, you know." Grace let out a quiet laugh, her heart softening at the certainty in her daughter's voice. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, kiddo. But this one's a big deal. If it goes well, it could turn into something permanent." Sophie grinned wide enough to show her braces. "Then you will do well, because you're awesome." Grace smiled back, warmth spreading through her tired bones at the simple truth of that unconditional love. Wrapping around her like a blanket, Sophie's words stayed in Grace's mind. "You're awesome." But deep down, she knew success wasn't promised. She'd been surfing a wave of small wins, each one fragile and fleeting. The pressure to keep that momentum alive pressed on her chest like a weight. One mistake, one bad batch, and the delicate balance she'd built could collapse overnight. The weeks leading up to the brunch event blurred together in a haze of flour-dusted late nights and caffeine-fueled early mornings. By day, Grace worked her shifts at the cafe. By night, she turned her tiny kitchen into a war zone of mixing bowls, sugar bags, and sticky notes plastered on every cabinet. "Don't forget extra vanilla. Cut baking time by 5 minutes." She caught herself whispering little pep talks while folding dough at 2 a.m. Anything to drown out the voice of doubt that sometimes hissed like Ethan's old dismissive laugh. "It's just a hobby." But this time, she pushed back. With every measured cup of sugar, she was rewriting that voice into silence. But stress had a cruel way of creeping in when she least expected it. One night, so drained she could barely keep her eyes open, Grace forgot to set the timer. The smell hit her first, the sharp, bitter edge of burnt sugar curling through her tiny apartment. When she yanked open the oven door, she stared at a tray of charred scones, the dark tops mocking her. For a moment, the room spun. She gripped the counter, her throat tight, a raw thought ripping through her mind. What if I ruin everything? She blinked back the burn of tears, forced herself to breathe, and scraped the ruined batch straight into the trash. Then she started over, hands shaking but steadying with each scoop of flour. Exhaustion nipped at her heels, but she couldn't slow down. One night, as she pulled a tray of scones from the oven, her phone buzzed across the counter. The screen glowed with a message from Peter. "How's the Bacon Queen doing? Need a taste tester?" She smiled, wiping flour off her face, and typed back, "Drowning in scones, but thanks for the offer." Moments later, her phone lit up with an incoming call. Peter's warm, teasing voice filled her tiny kitchen. "Hey, I'm serious. I could be there in 10 minutes with an empty stomach and high standards." Grace laughed, balancing the tray on the stovetop. "I appreciate the enthusiasm, but I'm good. Just tired." "Don't overwork yourself, Grace. Look how far you've come already." His gentle reminder wrapped around her heart like a hug she didn't even know she needed. "I know," she said softly, staring at the rows of cooling pastries, "but I can't afford to stop now." "Just remember to breathe," Peter said, his tone quiet but sure. "You've got this." The morning of the brunch event arrived crisp and clear. The smell of fresh pastries filling her old car as she loaded it carefully with trays of muffins, scones, and small cakes, each one boxed neatly and labeled with care. Her nerves tangled in her chest like knots, but she kept replaying Sophie's voice in her mind. "You're awesome." The cafe buzzed with chatter and the clink of mugs when Grace arrived. Lila rushed over, arms open, pulling her into a quick hug. "Everything looks incredible," Lila said, peeking into one of the boxes. "I knew you'd knock it out of the park." Grace set up her station in a sunny corner, arranging each pastry in tidy rows, adding handwritten signs she'd stayed up late making. She forced herself to stand still behind the counter, her hands fidgeting as the first wave of customers trickled in. The first bite came from a woman in a navy blazer. She chewed slowly, closed her eyes, and smiled. Then came the soft hum of murmured compliments, forks tapping plates, and the question she hadn't dared hope for. Where can I buy these? Each smile felt like an invisible stitch sewing her back together, piece by piece. This wasn't luck. This was hers, earned with sleepless nights and quiet courage. With each approving nod and satisfied grin, the tight knot in Grace's shoulders loosened. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it. Pride, pure and simple. Halfway through the brunch, Lila pulled her aside, practically glowing. I've had at least 5 people ask if they can order your pastries for their own events. You might need to hire help sooner than you think. Grace laughed, equal parts thrilled and terrified. I'll cross that bridge when I get there. But deep down, she knew it was closer than she'd ever imagined. Her tiny dream was growing into something real, something no one could take from her. That evening, Grace came home with flowers still dusting her sleeves, her heart light and her mind spinning with plans and possibilities. Sophie was curled up on the couch, a big bowl of popcorn balanced on her knees, a movie paused on the TV. How'd it go, Mom? Sophie asked, eyes wide with curiosity and pride. It went great, Grace said, dropping down onto the couch beside Sophie, her body aching but her heart light with relief. Better than I hoped for. People actually want to place orders now. Sophie's eyes sparkled. She shoved the bowl of popcorn into her mother's hands. Told you. You're basically famous. Grace laughed, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. Not quite famous, but maybe we're getting there. They sat together, the tension of the day melting away, replaced by something warmer and softer. Hope. For the first time in years, Grace felt like she was doing more than just surviving. She was thriving. And for the first time in forever, she allowed herself to picture a future that didn't depend on anyone but herself. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be messy, full of long nights and second guesses. And even though Ethan's ghost still lurked at the edges of her mind like a shadow she couldn't quite shake, she knew she was strong enough. For herself and for Sophie. She was ready for whatever came next. The rain fell steadily the next morning, tapping gently against the kitchen window while Grace flipped through a thick stack of invoices at the table. What had once been a humble side hustle born in a cramped apartment kitchen had exploded into a full-fledged business, one growing faster than she'd ever dreamed. Her phone buzzed with notifications every few seconds, emails from suppliers, last-minute orders from loyal customers, reminders about her afternoon meeting with a potential investor. She sighed, running a tired hand through her hair. Scaling up had always been the goal, but the speed at which things were happening left her breathless. She needed a bigger kitchen, a reliable team, and funding to make it sustainable. And today's meeting could make all of that possible. If the investor liked what he saw, she'd have the capital to open her very first brick-and-mortar bakery. A real store, not just a rented stall or borrowed cafe counter. The thought sent an excited shiver through her spine, and a wave of nerves right behind it. Sophie appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, hugging a bowl of cereal to her chest. She gave her mom a look, one eyebrow raised like a miniature detective. You've been up since 5 a.m., haven't you? Grace chuckled, even as exhaustion pulled at her eyes. Guilty. Had to get a head start. Big day today. Sophie plopped down beside her and scooped a mouthful of cereal. Are you nervous about the meeting? A little, Grace admitted, tapping her pen against her notebook. But it's the good kind of nervous. If this goes well, we'll finally have a real bakery. Sophie's grin practically split her face in two. Does that mean I get free cookies whenever I want? Grace laughed, shaking her head. Absolutely, but you'll have to help me bake them. Deal. Sophie leaned in, wrapping her arms tight around her mom's shoulders. Grace closed her eyes and held on for a moment longer than usual. No matter how chaotic things got, Sophie was her anchor. Her reason to push forward, no matter how tired she was. That afternoon, Grace found herself stepping into a sleek, glass-walled office downtown, the kind of place she hadn't walked into since her years as Ethan Carter's wife. High-tech conference rooms, polished marble floors, towering windows that overlook the heartbeat of the city. Walking into that sleek building brought back echoes of Grace's old life. Days when she'd trailed behind Ethan, through polished lobbies just like this one, playing the part of the perfect wife. But she pushed the memories aside. She was here for her, not for him or anyone else's legacy. Peter was already waiting in the lobby, looking unexpectedly sharp in a tailored suit that almost made her laugh. He caught her eye immediately and gave her a grin that steadied her jittery heart. "You've got this, Grace," he said, pulling her in for a quick, steadying hug. "Just be yourself." She nodded, though her pulse thudded hard in her throat. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like a slow crawl through her own doubts. But as soon as the door slid open, she squared her shoulders. She reminded herself who she was now. Not the woman Ethan had left behind, but a business owner who had fought tooth and nail to stand here on her own merit. The investor, a composed man in his mid-50s, named Andrew Morrison, greeted her with a firm handshake and guided her to a spacious conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city. An assistant set a steaming cup of coffee at her spot, and after a few polite pleasantries, they got down to business. Grace laid out her financials, growth projections, and glowing customer testimonials with the calmest voice she could muster, even as her nerves coiled tight beneath her blazer. She caught Andrew's occasional nods and thoughtful frowns, his questions sharp but fair, about her target audience, her production capacity, and how she'd handle scaling up. When she wrapped up, her palms were slick with sweat under the table, but her voice stayed steady. Andrew leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I have to say, Grace, I'm impressed. You've built this from scratch in a fraction of the time it takes most people, and your numbers back it up. I like what I'm seeing." Grace's breath caught for half a heartbeat, but she kept her face composed. "Thank you. I truly believe this business can keep growing with the right support." Andrew's mouth twitched into a grin. "I agree. I'm prepared to offer the funding you need, but naturally, I'd want a percentage of equity in return. We can hammer out the details, but I'm confident we can reach an arrangement." Relief flooded Grace so quickly her fingers tingled. She managed a professional nod, even though she wanted to throw her arms in the air and cheer. "That sounds fair. I'm open to negotiating terms." They shook hands to seal the moment, and when Grace stepped out into the lobby again, the invisible weight she'd carried for months felt a little lighter. Outside, the rain still fell, misting her hair as she tilted her face toward the gray sky and let out a long breath she'd been holding since she'd first dreamed of this day. Peter jogged up behind her, popping an umbrella open above their heads. His grin was all warmth and pride. "You did it," he said, nudging her playfully. Grace laughed, the sound breaking free like sunshine through the drizzle. "Yeah, I really did." "How do you feel?" Peter asked, nudging Grace's shoulder as they stood beneath his umbrella. "A little overwhelmed," Grace admitted with a shaky laugh, "but mostly excited." "You should be. This is huge, Grace." She nodded, the reality sinking in deeper with each breath. She wasn't just getting by anymore. She was thriving, and the future she'd once thought was out of reach was now right at her fingertips. Over the next few months, Grace poured every ounce of herself into growing the business. She secured a lease on a charming storefront in a lively part of town and transformed the space into a warm, inviting bakery. The walls were painted a soft cream, sunlight bouncing off rows of wooden shelves lined with jars of flour, sugar, and spices that doubled as decor. The air was always rich with the smell of fresh bread and buttery pastries, pulling in passers-by with its comforting sweetness. Sophie helped whenever she could, spending weekends at the bakery rolling out dough, decorating cookies, with extra sprinkles, of course, and giggling at her mom's gentle scolding when flour covered more of Sophie than the countertop. Their bond grew stronger with each batch of cookies and each quiet moment stolen behind the counter. Grace treasured it all. They were building this dream together. Opening day was a whirlwind. A line snaked down the sidewalk before the doors even opened, customers eager to taste the pastries they'd heard about through whispers, Instagram posts, and word-of-mouth praise. Grace hardly had a chance to breathe as orders poured in. The ringing cash register, the clatter of trays, the hum of happy chatter, all swirling around her like music. By the end of the day, the shelves were bare and the last crumbs swept into the bin. Grace stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a cloth. a grin glued to her face that refused to fade. Peter appeared just as she flipped the door sign to closed, a bottle of champagne tucked under his arm. "I figured you could use this," he teased, handing it over. Grace laughed, exhaustion and joy blurring together. "You know me too well." They sat at one of the small cafe tables, the soft glow of the overhead lights making the bakery feel like a quiet haven just for them. They clinked glasses and sipped, letting the bubbles wash over the months of worry and work. "You did it," Peter said, raising his glass again for emphasis. "This is only the beginning." Grace tapped her glass gently against his, her eyes sweeping over the counters, the display case, the little handwritten signs Sophie had helped make. "It is," she agreed softly. "But I couldn't have done it without you, or Sophie." Peter's smile softened, pride clear in his eyes. "No, Grace, you did this. You believed in yourself, finally." She let the last sip of champagne linger on her tongue, savoring the sweetness, the quiet, the warmth of hope that filled her from the inside out. She had built something no one could ever take from her, something hers. But she knew this was far from the end of the road. There would be new hurdles, new doubts, and somewhere in the shadows, Ethan's ghost would wait for a chance to shake her confidence. For now, though, she was right where she was meant to be. The sound of clinking glasses and soft laughter filled the grand ballroom of an upscale downtown hotel, where the city's annual Small Business Owners Gala buzzed under glittering chandeliers. Waiters wove through the crowd with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, while the city's most ambitious entrepreneurs swapped stories of hustle and hard-won success. Grace stood near a marble column, her black dress hugging her figure just right, her hair pinned up with elegant simplicity. On the outside, she radiated calm confidence, but under the polished surface, her heart pounded like a drum. This was her biggest event yet. Grace had been invited as one of the evening's featured business owners. Clear proof that her bakery wasn't just staying afloat. Sweet Revival had become a local favorite and was quickly gaining regional buzz. Write-ups in food blogs, a glossy feature in Midwest Living, and collaborations with trendy neighborhood cafes. Yet standing here among the city's best and brightest entrepreneurs, Grace couldn't quiet the tiny voice whispering that it could all slip away. In the far corners of her mind, the ghost of Ethan still lurked, ready to remind her she'd once been nothing more than his accessory. Peter's sudden appearance at her side jolted her back to reality. He handed her a glass of champagne and nudged her shoulder gently. "Why do you look like you're about to march into a boardroom brawl?" he teased, his grin disarming, as always. Grace let out a soft laugh, grateful for him in this moment more than ever. "Just nerves. It's a big night." Peter tipped his glass toward hers in a small toast. "Relax. Look around, Grace. You belong here. More than half these people do." She nodded and took a sip, the bubbles dancing on her tongue. She wanted to believe him, and mostly she did. But as she scanned the glittering crowd, her breath caught in her throat. Near the entrance, tall and self-assured in a perfectly tailored suit, stood Ethan Carter. Even now he looked every inch the polished businessman, hair neat, posture commanding, eyes sweeping the room like he still owned every piece of it. When his gaze collided with hers, a flicker of surprise crossed his face, and for a heartbeat, the ballroom seemed to freeze around her. Peter followed her line of sight and stiffened. "Is that?" "Yes." Grace's voice was quiet but steady as she set her glass down on a side table. "That's Ethan." "Do you want to get out of here?" Peter asked, lowering his voice. Grace shook her head, jaw firm. "No, I'm not running from him. Not anymore." She straightened her shoulders, squaring herself against the weight of her past as Ethan crossed the room toward her, that same signature half-smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Rumors had swirled lately about his shaky investments and messy board meetings, but she'd brushed them aside. Now seeing him here, she couldn't help but wonder if the rumors were true. "Grace," Ethan drawled smoothly, as if their divorce had been a routine inconvenience rather than the storm that nearly broke her. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Grace matched his calm with a cool edge of her own. "Funny, I was just thinking the same about you." Peter lingered protectively by her side, but she gave him a subtle glance. "I've got this." Ethan's eyes flicked to Peter, curiosity flashing briefly before settling back on her. "You've done well for yourself," he said, sweeping a hand toward the grand room around them. "I've heard about the bakery. Impressive growth." Grace crossed her arms lightly over her chest, her smile steady, her voice smooth as silk. "Thank you." "I've worked hard for it," Grace said, her voice steady. Ethan tilted his head slightly, that infuriating look of appraisal back in his eyes. "I suppose I underestimated you." To anyone else, the words might have sounded gracious, almost flattering. But Grace heard the smug undercurrent loud and clear, the disbelief that she had pulled off something he'd always assumed was beyond her. The thought lit a fire in her chest, hot and unshakable. "Yes, you did," she said, her tone razor sharp. "But I stopped needing your validation a long time ago." She caught a flicker in his eyes, something sour, something bruised, and felt an unexpected thrill of triumph twist beneath her ribs. Let him taste the smallest piece of the doubt he once fed her for years. For just a split second, Ethan's confident smirk faltered. Then he recovered, sliding the mask back into place. "You always were stubborn." Grace forced herself not to roll her eyes. "No, Ethan, I'm determined. There's a difference." Before he could respond, the crackle of the microphone cut through the tension. The host's voice boomed over the speakers, calling everyone's attention to the stage for the start of the award ceremony. Grace gave Ethan a polite, dismissive nod before slipping past him, leaving him standing alone amid the swirl of champagne flutes and glittering gowns. Later that night, after the gala had wound down and the last clusters of guests drifted into waiting cars, Grace found herself alone on the hotel's rooftop terrace. The city sprawled before her, a sea of blinking lights and possibilities. The crisp air bit at her skin, but she welcomed it. Clarity was easier to find in the cold. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to see Peter approaching, his tie loosened, jacket draped over one arm, a familiar softness in his eyes. "I figured I'd find you up here," he said. Grace smiled faintly and leaned against the stone railing. "I just needed a breath. Tonight was a lot." Peter joined her at the ledge, shoulder to shoulder. "You handled yourself like a pro, especially with Ethan." Grace's fingers tightened around the cool stone. "It wasn't easy. Seeing him brought back more than I expected." She could still feel her pulse hammering from the confrontation, the weight of years that used to crush her chest now flickering like a ghost she could finally banish. Peter kept his eyes on the skyline. "You've come too far to let him mess with your head. Don't let him rewrite what you've built." "I won't," Grace said, her voice firm, then softer. "But it's not just him, it's everything. The growth, the expectations. Sometimes it feels like I'm balancing on a tightrope, and one slip." Peter turned to face her fully, warmth and certainty written all over his face. "That feeling? It means you're doing it right, but you're not the same woman he left behind. You're stronger, and you're not doing this alone anymore." A lump rose in Grace's throat, but she swallowed it back and smiled. "Thank you, Peter. I needed that." They stood together in a comfortable silence, the hum of the city a steady soundtrack to everything she had fought for. Grace's phone buzzed in her clutch. She glanced at the screen. An email from Lila, one of her very first cafe clients, congratulating her on the glowing press coverage the bakery had just received. She tucked her phone away, her breath misting in the chill. The old version of herself, the one who would have read Ethan's smirk as the final word on her worth, was gone. She had built this life, brick by brick, order by order. No old ghosts could take that from her now. In the weeks that followed, Grace poured every ounce of that fire back into Sweet Revival. She negotiated a deal with a regional grocery chain, landing shelf space in stores across the state. What had started in her cramped kitchen had become something real, something bigger than even her wildest late-night dreams. And this time, no one, not even Ethan, could rewrite that story. Grace hired a small but dedicated team, a talented pastry chef to keep up with growing orders, a marketing coordinator to manage press and social media buzz, freeing her to focus on the bigger picture. Her days blurred into a steady rhythm of team meetings, recipe testing, and managing production schedules. But the long hours didn't faze her anymore. Every new milestone reminded her exactly why she had started. Not to prove Ethan wrong, but to prove to herself that she was more than capable. But Ethan hadn't vanished completely from her world. He still popped up at charity galas and business mixers, always quick with a smooth, offhand comment that suggested he might want to rekindle what they'd lost. Whether it was curiosity, regret, or his bruised ego, Grace didn't waste time trying to figure it out. She knew one thing for certain: she'd never orbit him again. One evening, after another 12-hour day at Sweet Revival, Grace curled up on the couch with Sophie, both wrapped in a cozy blanket, while a cooking competition flickered on the TV. Sophie leaned against her mom's side, munching popcorn and offering sharp critiques of each contestant's dish. "Think you could win this show, Mom?" Sophie teased, nudging her with an elbow. Grace laughed, tipping her head back against the cushions. "Maybe, but I'm pretty happy running my show." Sophie nodded, eyes big and serious for a moment. "I'm proud of you, you know, for all of this." A warmth bloomed deep in Grace's chest, stronger than any award or headline. She pulled her daughter close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm proud of us, sweetheart. We did this together." As the credits rolled and the house settled into a quiet hush, Grace realized the truth she'd spent years chasing. This life, this quiet, honest happiness, was the real prize. Not the contracts, not the magazine spreads, not proving Ethan wrong. It was about proving herself right. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter sat alone in his office. The city's skyline spread wide beyond the towering windows like a painting of wealth and ambition. Tonight, though, the view mocked him. His once mighty empire, the corporate crown he'd spent decades polishing, was cracking beneath him. The city lights no longer promised success. They flickered like reminders of everything slipping through his fingers. Stacks of financial reports cluttered his glass desk, each one confirming the same grim truth. Hemorrhaging investments, declining profits, a restless board whispering about his replacement. The rumors he'd brushed off as petty gossip months ago were now undeniable fact. He dragged a hand through his neatly styled hair until it stuck up in frustrated tufts, sinking back into his leather chair. The phone buzzed and buzzed again. Lawyers, creditors, board members demanding explanations he no longer had. And in that suffocating silence, his mind circled back to the image of Grace at the gala. Radiant, assured, untouchable, in a way she had never been when she was his. At first he'd been curious, maybe even a little amused by her transformation. But now, with his world splintering around him, her success scraped at his pride like sandpaper. She'd built something unshakable from the ashes of the life he'd left her to bury. And he was watching everything he'd built burn. A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Vanessa, standing at his office door, her tone sharp with irritation. "Are you just gonna sit there all night?" Vanessa demanded, standing in the doorway with her arms folded tight across her designer blazer. The sharp click of her heels on the hardwood floor cut through the suffocating silence of the office like a warning bell. She looked every bit the trophy wife he'd once flaunted. Polished, perfect, untouchable. But tonight, her presence felt more like a cage. "I'm thinking," Ethan muttered, staring past her at the blurred city lights beyond the glass. He didn't dare meet her eyes. "You've been thinking for weeks, and what good has it done?" Vanessa's voice cracked with impatience. "Your company is falling apart, Ethan. What exactly are you doing to stop it?" He shot to his feet so quickly that the edge of his desk rattled, sending a half-full coffee mug crashing to the floor. Ceramic shards skittered across the wood. "I don't need a lecture right now, Vanessa." She scoffed, stalking closer, her stilettos ticking like a countdown clock. "You used to be unstoppable. Remember that? Where's that man now?" Ethan's hands balled into fists at his sides. Her words sank into him like nails driven into soft wood. "That man is still here," he growled. Vanessa lifted a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her mouth curling into a sneer. "Really? Because all I see is someone flailing while everything he built goes up in flames." The tension crackled between them, sharp enough to cut the air. Finally, Vanessa pivoted on her heel, striding toward the door. She paused just long enough to fling her final words over her shoulder. "I can't live like this. If you can't fix it, don't expect me to stick around." The door slammed so hard that the framed photos on his desk rattled. Ethan sank back into his chair, shoulders hunched, breath ragged. For the first time, the truth roared louder than his denial. He wasn't just losing a company, he was losing everything. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of last-ditch meetings and hollow promises. Ethan begged investors for lifelines, pitched impossible turnarounds to his board and watched every plan crumble under the weight of his past reckless choices. The bold acquisitions, the leveraged risks, they'd all come calling now, and they were hungry. At home, the atmosphere soured to icy silence. Vanessa gave up pretending to care. She slipped out for parties and networking galas while he stayed locked in his office, drowning in unpaid invoices and regret. Until one morning, Ethan stumbled into the walk-in closet to find empty hangers swaying gently. On the kitchen counter, her final note sat waiting for him like a death certificate. "I can't do this anymore. Don't call me." He crushed the paper in his fist, but the words echoed anyway. She had left. The irony sliced deeper than any financial ruin. He'd traded Grace for Vanessa, and now Vanessa had vanished when he needed her most. Desperation clawed at him, raw and ugly. In the suffocating quiet, only one name rose in his mind. One person who might understand the fall because she'd survived his betrayal before. Swallowing what pride he had left, Ethan picked up his phone and found Grace's number. He forced himself to hit call before he could change his mind. Grace was in the middle of piping buttercream roses onto a batch of cupcakes when her phone buzzed across the counter. She wiped her fingers on a kitchen towel, glanced at the screen, and froze. Ethan. Her gut reaction was to let it ring. Ignore it like a ghost knocking on a locked door. But curiosity, inconvenient and stubborn, bubbled up anyway. With a sigh, she swiped to answer. "Ethan." There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end before Ethan's voice came through. Strained, rough, almost unrecognizable. "Grace, I need to see you." Grace leaned back against the counter, her brow knitting in suspicion. "What's this about, Ethan?" "Please." His tone cracked with something she hadn't heard from him in years. Desperation. "It's important." Against her better judgment, and a dozen silent warnings in her head, Grace agreed to meet him at a small cafe not far from Sweet Revival. She arrived early, claiming a table by the rain-speckled window. Outside, the drizzle turned the city sidewalks to silver streaks under street lamps. When Ethan finally stepped inside, she almost didn't recognize him. The suit was still designer, but hung too loosely on his shoulders. Shadows pooled under his eyes where confidence used to shine. "Thank you for coming," he said, sinking into the chair opposite her. Grace folded her hands on the table, her posture steady as stone. "What do you want, Ethan?" He inhaled shakily, as if the question itself weighed a ton. "Everything's falling apart. The company, my marriage, it's all gone, Grace." She tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost curious. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about that?" Ethan looked down at his hands. They trembled just enough to betray him. "I don't know. I just needed someone to talk to." The irony stung her tongue like a secret she'd waited years to say out loud. The same man who had tossed her aside like an old coat was now here, grasping for comfort he no longer deserved. But Grace wasn't that woman anymore, the one who would have given anything to patch up his broken edges. "Ethan," she said gently but firmly, "you made your choices. You built that empire, and you tore it down with the same hands." He flinched, her words sharper than he expected. I know I messed up." Grace leaned back, her eyes steady, her heart steady too. "I spent years trying to be what you wanted, and when I wasn't enough, you replaced me. I hit rock bottom, Ethan, but I climbed out. I saved myself. You have to stop looking for other people to do it for you." Silence fell between them, heavy and absolute, broken only by the soft tap of rain against the glass. Ethan stared out the window, watching the city blur into watercolor shadows. And for the first time he realized this was his burden alone. He'd broken it, and only he could bear the wreckage. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words fragile and unfamiliar in his mouth. Grace's expression softened just a fraction, but her resolve stayed firm. "I don't need your apology, Ethan. I moved on. You should figure out how to do the same." She stood, placing a few bills on the table to cover her untouched coffee. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, out of his storm and back into her own hard-won calm. A sense of closure washed over Grace as she stepped out into the gentle rain, leaving Ethan behind that cafe window like a ghost finally laid to rest. The chapter of her life that had once revolved around him was over. Truly, deeply over. Inside, Ethan remained at the table, staring at the blurred city beyond the rain-streaked glass. He'd thought that reaching out to Grace might offer him a scrap of peace. Instead, it carved out a brutal truth. She had grown beyond him, and he was still trapped in the wreckage he'd created. For the first time, Ethan Carter truly understood what it meant to lose. The bakery door swung open to the bright chill of a crisp morning, the little bell overhead jingling like a soft note of welcome. Grace stood behind the counter, flour dusting her fingertips as she carefully arranged a tray of warm, buttery croissants. The cozy aroma of pastries and freshly brewed coffee curled through the air, wrapping every customer in comfort the moment they stepped inside. It had been 6 months since the grand opening of Sweet Revival, and every dawn reminded her just how far she had come. What had once been a fragile dream buried under the ruins of a broken marriage was now a bustling shop alive with laughter, warmth, and the quiet hum of second chances. The front door creaked open again, and Sophie waltzed in with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a mischievous grin already brewing on her face. She ducked behind the counter before Grace could scold her, pinching a still warm piece of bread straight off the tray. "Sophie," Grace chided, though a helpless laugh bubbled up anyway. "You're supposed to be on your way to school." "I have time," Sophie said, mouth full, grinning wider. "Besides, I needed breakfast, didn't I?" Grace rolled her eyes and handed her a paper bag with a fresh muffin tucked inside. "Here, take this, and don't be late." Sophie leaned up to plant a quick kiss on her mother's cheek. "You're the best," she said through a mouthful of pastry before slipping out into the morning rush. Grace watched her go, heart blooming with a peace she hadn't felt in years. Her daughter was thriving. Her business was thriving. And for once she wasn't bracing for life to collapse beneath her feet. The morning rush rolled on, regulars calling her by name, newcomers marveling at the scent of warm bread and the soft jazz humming through the speakers. By mid-morning, the line finally dwindled, giving Grace a rare moment to breathe. She poured herself a mug of coffee, savoring its warmth, as she leaned against the counter and watched the bustling street beyond the window. A street that once felt so daunting, but now felt like hers. Her phone buzzed on the polished counter. A text from Peter. "Dinner tonight?" "I have something to celebrate." Grace smiled, her chest tightening in the sweetest way. She typed back, "Sure. I'll meet you at 7. Peter had been her steady anchor through it all, reminding her of her worth when old shadows whispered lies, cheering her on when she faltered. Over time, their friendship had quietly bloomed into something more, slow and careful, never rushed, never forced. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the start of something. That evening, Grace stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting soft curls at her shoulders and smoothing the fabric of her dress. She'd chosen something simple yet elegant, a deep burgundy dress that hugged her just right without demanding attention. She leaned closer, brushing on a final sweep of lipstick. And for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't feel like she was preparing to be enough for someone else. She felt like she was finally, gloriously enough for herself. She caught her reflection in the mirror and paused. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same Grace who had once been small and broken under the weight of someone else's plans. This Grace was steady, confident, free. She let herself smile, just a small curve of the lips, but it felt like a hard-earned victory all the same. When she arrived at the restaurant, Peter was already waiting at a candlelit table by the window. He stood as soon as he spotted her, and the way his eyes lit up made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't thought possible anymore. "You look incredible," he said, pulling out her chair for her. "Thank you," Grace said softly, feeling her cheeks warm at the sincerity in his voice. Once they settled in, Peter lifted his glass of wine. "To new beginnings," he said, his tone carrying more meaning than the simple words could hold. Grace raised her own glass, clinking it gently against his. "To new beginnings." Over dinner, they talked about everything. The bakery's new wholesale deal, Sophie's latest school project, weekend plans. But under all the light conversation, Grace could feel it. Peter had something more on his mind. She didn't push him. She didn't need to. When dessert plates were cleared away, Peter reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. His grip was warm, steady. "I've watched you grow into this incredible woman, Grace," he said, his voice low, unwavering. I know how hard you fought to get here, and I'm so damn proud of you. But I also know there's room for more. More happiness, more love, if you want it." Grace's breath caught. She squeezed his hands, the weight of the moment pressing gently against her ribs. "I do," she whispered. Peter smiled, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "I want to be part of this next chapter with you, not just as a friend, as someone who stands beside you, for all of it." Emotion rose in her chest so fiercely she could hardly speak, but when she did, her voice was soft and sure. "I want that too." Peter leaned in, their foreheads brushing. In that quiet closeness, Grace felt the last remnants of her old burdens slip away. She was no longer defined by the man who had left her, or the pain she'd once carried like a second skin. She was defined by everything she'd built and everything she was ready to let in. The weeks that followed brimmed with new routines and gentle changes. Peter became part of her daily life in the best possible way, never overshadowing, always fitting in exactly where she needed him. They shared sleepy mornings at Sweet Revival, late-night talks over mugs of chamomile tea, and weekends full of laughter and little adventures that reminded Grace how light life could feel when shared with the right person. But the biggest surprise arrived on an ordinary afternoon that began like any other. Grace was cleaning up the bakery's back room when she froze mid-sweep, her mind spinning through the dates on her calendar. She was late, unmistakably late. Heart pounding, she grabbed a test from the pharmacy on her way home. Her hands trembled as she waited, pacing the bathroom floor in her slippers. When the second line appeared, clear and undeniable, tears pooled in her eyes and a laugh broke through her shock. Sophie was the first to know. Grace sat her down in the living room, her voice shaking with nerves and wonder all at once. After a heartbeat of silence, Sophie's eyes went wide. Then she squealed and threw her arms around her mother's neck. "I'm going to be a big sister." Sophie practically bounced in her seat, eyes wide, cheeks pink with excitement. "Really?" she squealed. Grace laughed through happy tears, nodding. "You're going to be amazing, sweetheart." Sophie threw her arms around her mother's neck, hugging her tight enough to steal Grace's breath for a heartbeat. And in that warm, giggling tangle, Grace felt it deep in her bones. Her family was whole again. When Grace told Peter, his reaction was nearly the same. Pure joy, laced with just enough disbelief to make him laugh through tears of his own. He pulled her close, pressing his lips to her forehead, whispering into her hair, "We're going to be great parents." The months that followed blurred together in the sweetest way. There were doctor's appointments and nursery shopping trips, quiet evenings folding impossibly tiny onesies on the couch, and laughter echoing through a house that felt more like a home than she'd ever imagined. Grace kept working at Sweet Revival, trusting her team more than ever and handing off tasks without fear, because she had built this business strong enough to stand on its own. And every evening, she came home to Peter's steady love, Sophie's bubbling excitement, and the gentle hum of a new chapter waiting to begin. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, she would press a hand to her belly and whisper half-formed dreams to the tiny heartbeat inside her. Promises that this child would never doubt they were safe, or loved, or enough. One sunny afternoon, Grace stood in the soft yellow nursery, arranging tiny clothes in a freshly painted dresser. Peter stepped in behind her, setting a mug of tea on the nightstand before wrapping his arms around her, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" he asked quietly, his voice brushing her ear like a promise. Grace smiled, threading her fingers through his. "All the time, and I wouldn't change a single part of it." Peter pressed a kiss to her temple, his warmth melting into her skin. "Neither would I." The day their baby arrived, the world seemed to hold its breath just for them. Grace cradled the tiny bundle to her chest, her heart swelling so full it ached in the best way. Sophie perched beside her on the hospital bed, wide-eyed and awed by her new sibling, while Peter stood close enough to touch them all, tears glistening bright in his eyes. Grace felt the ache of old wounds ease in that quiet room, replaced by a fierce, gentle gratitude for every jagged step that had led her here. Grace looked around that sunlit room. At Peter, at Sophie, at the baby nestled safely in her arms, and she knew without doubt, this was the life she had fought for. Not a perfect life, but a true one. made whole by every heartbreak she'd survived and every bit of love she'd learned to accept. Peter sat beside her, one arm slipping around her shoulders. Grace leaned into him, brushing her lips to his jaw, her voice soft but certain as she whispered words she had once thought she'd never believe again. "We made it." Peter's answering smile said everything. Indeed, they had. So the story is over. And my wonderful friends, are you really still here with me at this hour? If you are, then there must be something in Grace's journey that's stirring something deep in your heart too. Maybe it's the way she fell apart, or maybe it's the way she built herself back up, piece by fragile piece, until she could stand taller than the man who once made her feel small. Let's take a breath together and look at what this story leaves behind for all of us. Life can break you. People you love can abandon you. Doors can slam so hard you think you'll never find another open one again. But as Grace shows us, and as the poet Rumi once said, the wound is the place where the light enters you. No matter how wrecked your plans are tonight, or how tired your soul feels, I want you to remember this. Healing is messy. Reinventing yourself is exhausting. And yes, the ghosts of your past might try to knock on your door when you least expect it. But you, my friend, get to decide if you open it. Like Grace, you can choose to build your own table when they won't give you a seat at theirs. You can choose to rise with flour on your apron and love in your chest, one small, brave decision at a time. So if you're here sitting with me in this quiet corner of the internet, I want to say thank you. Thank you for caring enough about Grace's story to feel it in your bones. If it touched you, please don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and hit subscribe so more people can find a little hope when they need it most. Remember, fall 7 times, stand up 8. Grace did. So can you, and so can I. We're in this together. Until next time, take gentle care of that beautiful, breakable heart of yours.